Welcome back, everyone. Today we will hear from Dr. Scott Thumma, who serves as a professor of sociology of religion at Hartford International University and is the director of the Hartford Institute for Religion Research. Scott co-leads the Faith Communities Today National Research Project and has conducted 7 national studies of megachurches and 3 national studies of non-denominational churches. He is also the principal investigator for the Lilly Endowment Thriving in Ministry grant and a large 5-year grant to study the impact of the pandemic on churches. It is this project on the impact of the pandemic on congregations that we will hear about today. To get things started, I'll welcome Scott. We look forward to hearing from you.
So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the research that we're doing. It's called Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations, affectionately known around here as EPIC, so that, we're doing some epic research. It's quite enjoyable. The project is a 5-year study of Christian churches around the country, generously funded by Lilly, and is a really complex mixed methods sort of approach. But what we're trying to do is track faith communities across this time to see not so much exactly how they responded to the pandemic, but what are the long-term effects of the last few years. And I don't have to tell you, but it's a moving target, right? Things continue to evolve. Each time we've been in the field, things look a little bit different. Primarily what we're focusing on is how did congregations respond to the pandemic? We've asked questions looking back over how they have dealt with various aspects of congregational life. But more importantly, we keep going into the field in regular intervals over the last 1.5 to 2 years, and will continue in the next 3 years, taking sort of snapshots of the congregational life to see how things are evolving. But then the ultimate purpose is to look at this long-term consequences. At the same time, we're also looking at congregational leadership, and we're looking at questions of what were some of the unique challenges put upon congregations of color, and then obviously how technology is changing what we know about congregational life. I said it was a pretty complex project. This gives you a little bit of a glimpse at what we're doing. We're doing national surveys, key informant surveys of clergy usually, or a lay leader, and we're doing those regularly throughout the years that we're doing the study. We are just now in the process in 2023 of rolling out a large national survey, and so we're doing a lot of surveying. But then we're also we've put together a panel of at currently about 250 congregations that we're following all the way along those 5 years, the same congregations. And then we're also doing about 100 case studies where we can go in depth and do interviews and observations and such. And we're looking at those 100 congregations in 8 different locations around the country. So we have teams out in the field. And then finally, we're going to be doing a large attender survey in 2024. And we're hoping to ask about 100,000 people in the pews how they experienced worship, how they handled the pandemic, whether they like hybrid worship, whether they would prefer to be online or offline, in person. And so all of those together over the 5 years, we think will give us a pretty comprehensive picture. But there's also other work that's being done. And so we're also in collaborative partnerships with 6 or more other projects that are taking place that are looking at how denominations are dealing with it, how seminaries are dealing with the pandemic, and to try to get a holistic picture of what's happening. thus far, what we've done are three specific EPIC surveys, but in fact, part of the reason why I think the Lilly Endowment was interested in what we had proposed was I'm also the director for a project called Faith Communities Today, which has been since the year 2000 surveying congregations every so often to try to understand congregational dynamics. And just before the pandemic in 2020, we did our large national survey, and we had about 2/3 of that survey finished by the time they closed everything with the pandemic. And so we made some tweaks to our survey and ended up with over 15,000 responses from congregations that really gave us a good sort of baseline of this is what it looked like just before the pandemic. And then since then, we have done our more pandemic-oriented surveys in the summer of 21, in the fall, winter of 21. And then the last survey we did was in the spring of 22. And as I said, we're just now rolling out a survey. It has just started, and we hope by March or April to have our newest results. Then I also said we're involved in doing the longitudinal panel with, we're up to about 250 churches now. And I think we have completed so far now almost 85 case studies. So we have a massive amount of data, but it really, and I'll touch on some of the results very soon, but it really is, the short term of it is things are in flux. Each time we go into the field, we see something slightly different, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we move along. But now I think, Noemi, you can take it away.
Yes, yeah. So before we go into breakout rooms, I want you to ponder on the following question. What has the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic been like for your organization?
All right, so in my breakout, I started getting asked about our findings. So a few folks got a preview, but now for all of you. I want to zip through some of these pretty quickly, and I'll definitely share the slides, so don't worry if I'm going too fast for you. I want to just give you a big overview picture of some of what we're finding. And basically, most congregations have had members who have tested positive. That was 90% pre-Omicron. I'm sure it's probably nearly 100%. Maybe about half the ministry staff have tested positive. And we've had at least a third of congregations that said they had someone die of the virus. So a pretty big impact. Interestingly, only about 2/3 of clergy encouraged people to get the vaccine. And only 8% served as a testing or vaccination site. And as I told my group, I was a little surprised about the level of conflict. I expected it to be greater. Certainly there was quite a bit, but most of it seemed to be pretty mild. And as of the latest accounting, which would have been March last year, a vast majority of the churches were worshiping both in person and online, 80% of them. There was only about 15% that had decided to be in person only. And there was still, at that time, 5% that were only online. So a real variety there. Now, it's obviously clear that the demand for services among congregations grew during the pandemic. In 30 to 40% of congregations, those demands increased, but it did decrease in some. Not only that, congregations really stepped up to reach that demand. About 55% of congregations that we surveyed said that they either started new programs or significantly increased the programs that they were doing as a result of the pandemic. And, you know, most of those are in traditional ways that congregations reach out to their communities, but it was still quite amazing to see that more than half of them really reached out and started new activities. And it's even more interesting because one of the things that we found that was probably the most surprising was the dramatic decline in volunteering. Pre-pandemic, and this was true for many of the Faith Communities Today surveys, it was about 40 to 45% of people in the congregation would be volunteers. And when we asked pastors in 21 and 22, it was 15% of their people volunteer regularly. And that has crept up a little bit in the spring of 22, but we're very interested to see what's going to happen. So we have congregations with greater demand, more programs that they're offering, and yet not as many people offering. And so essentially what you have is the clergy picking up a lot of that, and then the volunteers who are there are actually doing double and triple duty to try to service things, and that's a good direction for burnout. We also saw a kind of mixed picture with the budgets, that in fact giving had gone up during the pandemic, and our last accounting of it in 22 was that it had come back down to the level that was pre-pandemic. And it's not true, it's not equal across all congregations. Some of them saw giving increase, then some saw decrease, and in fact about 30% said that their viability is at risk because of the pandemic, and actually almost 20% said that their continued existence is threatened. And when you look at that group, they obviously were in trouble before the pandemic, but this has just hastened some of that. Now, one of the things that's obvious to us through the data is that there are different perceptions of the pandemic. The pandemic affected all congregations, but the perception of how that pandemic was affecting them was really dramatically different. Whether they were struggling with some of those or they had disruptions, we see on both sides people who agree and people who disagree, and this plays out in both generally and also across denominational traditions. In this case, around whether they encourage them to get vaccinated or not, but also the idea of their continued existence is threatened. It's pretty clear that again, the pandemic impact isn't equally felt across all these groups. It's also clear that it's a matter of size in many ways. One of the things that we've seen is that the smaller the size, the more challenges that the pandemic has caused, whether that's around financial or around disruptions in programming, in this case, religious education. But also the capacity to continue to do new programs and to bounce back from the challenges of the pandemic itself. It's very clear that the larger the congregation, the more resources it has, and therefore the more adaptable it would be post-pandemic. The other interesting thing that we're noticing is that the attitudes of both the clergy and also the congregation really make a big difference. We had asked a number of questions that specifically say, how optimistic are you about coming out of this stronger, or thinking of new ways to ministry or new opportunities? And depending on, and we created a scale of these questions, and depending on where the congregation falls along here, it really describes two very different realities. And we could say, you know, optimistic and pessimistic, but I think it really goes even deeper than that. And it makes a big difference. Those congregations that have low level of optimism compared to those that have high level of optimism just really do look significantly different in terms of growth, but also in how they measure their own sense of spiritual vitality. It also has a significant effect by faith tradition, that with clearly the mainline Protestant being the least optimistic in some ways, having the fewest, the smallest percentage of those that are high optimistic. And it's also true that, again, unfortunately, the larger the congregation, the more it says it really thinks that it can come out of the pandemic strong. And if you look at those congregations that have the highest optimism, you also see that, because we ask a battery of questions about to the leader themselves about their mental and spiritual and physical health, and you see a very strong correlation between their own health and the health of the congregation, measured a whole bunch of ways, but encapsulated in this optimism scale too. So I think there are a lot of implications about this, but I'm going to pass it back to Noemi right now, and we can chat about some of this.
Awesome, thank you. I'll add the question in the chat just so that we all have it before we go into our breakout groups. But our breakout room question is, do the findings presented match your experience? And how optimistic would you say your organization or congregation is about the future? Welcome back, everyone. After this next section, we will have some time for Q&A. So I encourage you to begin thinking about anything you'd like to ask or comment on. And so now I'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Okay. Let me grab my screen again, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the implications. Obviously, I didn't give you hardly but a taste of some of our results, so I hope we touch on more of those in the Q&A. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the implications that I think are both challenges and also the possibilities. Now, not too surprising, for some of these shouldn't come as any surprise, but I think one of the things that we're seeing is attendance is somewhat down. Probably about 30 to 40% in most congregations in terms of face-to-face attendance. Obviously, volunteering is down and maybe still down. We'll see pretty soon. And giving is also a bit of a challenge. But all of those are rough. But I think what they really mean is that there are challenges to the level of commitment. And that has been disrupted. And so in some ways, we need to begin to think about how do we get our people to recommit and woo them back into the levels that they once were active and engaged with. Another thing is that in some sense, virtual participation isn't going to go away, but it needs to be more than just a talking head. It needs to be more than just the sermon or the worship service, right? I mean, most people actually don't belong to a congregation and come to a congregation just because of the service, just because of the sermon, right? They also come for the fellowship, they come for the bad coffee, they come for service and activities and engagement with others. And so we have to think about, if we're going to keep virtual participation, then how do we make that more robust? How do we make that like the experience that most people have by being a part of a congregation? We don't just want spectators, right? We want engaged people. That's a challenge. Obviously, also, if there are fewer people or fewer people are coming into the building, there's changing facility needs. And so then how do we think about alternative uses of this space? And many people are starting to wrestle with some of that. Not only that, there are new ministry patterns that are evolving, and hybridity is one of those. But I often talk about it as, in some sense, the pandemic was like a hurricane or tornadoes were going on around us, and we're all huddled in our basements trying to survive and do whatever we have to. But this post-pandemic period is us kind of coming up out of the basement and going, okay, the world is different than before. So how do we remake the world? Do we just copy what was there before, or do we think about the patterns that we never liked in the first place and kind of work around those and create new things? So we've thought of the last couple of years as really exhausting, but in fact, we've only been reacting to the external situations. Now we're in a period of time when we're all exhausted, and yet it really calls us now to be creative and to be innovative and to say, okay, we're gonna rebuild in a better and different way. Well, that need for change and adaptation also comes with even further exhaustion, I think, in many ways. And then if we look at the larger picture of American religion, I think there are a lot of congregations that are challenged. There's going to be, I think, a lot of closures and mergers and other kinds of evolving demographic patterns like the nuns that are really going to challenge our future. But I don't want to leave on that optimistic note. I do want to talk a little bit about, I think that this is a good time in some ways to be creative and we can't use the excuse, well, this is the way we've always done it, because in an amazing way, congregations did what I would never have guessed. They actually changed. They actually adapted, and almost overnight, and so I think we can build on that bit of success. Most congregations really, in our open-ended questions, were like, we survived this. We made the adaptations that we had to. So I think it's that the potential is there to come up with new models and new dynamics. And we're also seeing in a lot of our congregations that not everybody's coming back who was there before, but in the congregations that are starting to flourish, there is a new clientele. There are new folks coming in, and people who never before would have shown up are starting to show up, as well as those who are able now to join the congregation, even virtually, who were previously excluded, like the folks that worked on the weekends or people with special needs or others. So there are lots of opportunities there. And so the question is, do you replicate the old patterns or do you reinvent? And this seems like a perfect time to ask that question. and the possibility of reinventing who you are. It is certainly there and has played out over the last couple of years. I think it's also most congregations partnered to make it through the pandemic, and so hopefully that pattern of networking and partnering with other organizations will stay there. So, and as you saw in some of the data that I showed, that optimism really does make a lot of the difference. So you need to expect a positive outcome and sell a new vision of the future, and people will rally around that, I think. So here are some of our resources. All the EPIC research can be found at covidreligionresearch.org. And I would encourage you also to look at our 2020 Faith Communities Today research, but we have plenty of research there. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Now I'll turn things over to Dave Higgle from the Wesleyan Church, who will moderate today's Q&A. And Dave, I saw Thad posed a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll let you take over. And then we'll have Melinda wants to ask another question or comment.
Okay, great. I would say you could either unmute yourself or post a question in the chat. I know we only have a few minutes, but the first question here is that you had touched on this, Scott, but the question is, I'd like to hear more in philanthropic studies. In philanthropic studies, we often talk about how the single greatest predictor, if someone will give to a congregation, is if they attend a congregation. But the single greatest predictor of how much someone will give is involvement or volunteering. Yeah. So what does the decline in volunteering potentially mean for the finances of congregations for them to be able to move forward?
Yeah, that's a significant question, and one that we're watching. Right, we saw that giving drop off a little bit, and with the current state of the economy, I'm really concerned to see what those kinds of incomes levels are going to look like. One positive thing though, and this had come out of 20 years of the Faith Communities Today data. Whenever I would analyze the data, if a congregation had online giving, it was absolutely clear that online giving increased per capita giving by about $100 per person. And if a congregation emphasized online giving, it actually increased the income by about $300 per person. So many congregations switching over to online giving, I think has really helped. I would have predicted for sure that giving would have gone up, even if, it was just because they were doing online. But it is a challenge because that link is there about engagement and involvement and giving. And is that going to hold true if someone is only participating virtually? Is that going to also continue? So it's right. Going to be a challenge.
Yeah, thank you. Melinda Contreras-Byrd, I think you had a question you'd like to ask? Yes.
I had a question and then I had a statement that I have to make. The question was I'm interested in the inclusion of BIPOC communities in the study because from what I've experienced, some of those things I think are different. And the thing that I really do want to stress is that I think I always refer to this as the time of double pandemic. And I say that because we had the pandemic of death through disease and having to stay away from people and not being able to go, all of that was just traumatizing. But for communities of color and poor communities, there was a double pandemic. And particularly for those who wound up being killed, and you every day you were hearing more and more and more of that. So the thing that I want to say that to me is extremely important is that I think we've been given a rare opportunity that I pray to God that we don't miss. And that opportunity is to dialogue about trauma from different points of view. And I said when we were in our group that Black and Latinx people, those are my communities, have been through so much trauma that this doesn't necessarily faze them as much or take away their hope. You know, we've built communities and had them burned down just because they were built by someone Black, or, you know, we can go through history what has happened. But I think this is a time where we can share trauma. And I think that can open up some real healing and in dialogue across cultures in the Christian community. And I think we do not have that. We just don't really understand each other. And I don't think people of color have been honest about how much we're suffering and how angry we have been over the years. So this whole thing about racial trauma and so forth that came up, it was never addressed when I was in my doctoral program. And I don't think we even had a word. We had no name for that. But as it began, people began to look at it and think about what my grandmama told me, you know, and what it was like for them and great grandparents and so forth. You know, we have so much diverse culture in this country, and yet it doesn't bring us together because we don't talk honestly. Our fear is that we're going to hurt someone's feelings. Our fear is that we're going to alienate each other. But I think that truth can only unite you if you really want to be united with people. So I just couldn't leave without saying that, because I think that that's one of the things we really need to look at and be challenged to do during this time as a result of this.
Thank you, Scott. Do you have a quick response? We'd like to get one more question in if we could, but I want to give you opportunity to, if you have anything to share in response.
Well, I completely agree with what you said. I think in the data, we are starting to see some of a sort of greater level of resilience in some of the congregations of color. But in the early phase of our surveying, we were trying one approach and didn't get a large enough percentage of congregations of color, and that worried me and bothered me. And so we've tried a different strategy now to work through networks. And but in the African American congregations that we surveyed, where we did have a large enough representation, they look significantly different. And we're working on a report right now that shows just how different they are, both in positive ways and also in challenging ways. So it's definitely something we're taking to heart.
Another question. Do you have any data concerning clergy attrition at this stage of your research?
If I may, I'll quickly grab this, and I think that here we go. I get asked this question. Essentially, we haven't seen, and I've been talking with many denominational leaders, we haven't seen a large exodus of clergy. And I know you've heard and probably seen the headlines that how many people are seriously considering leaving the ministry. And if you just ask, have you thought about seriously considering, almost 40% said they've thought that. But if you start to look more deeply at how they answer that question, how often have you thought that? Basically, you see that people that have thought it very often is really only about 3% of clergy, and fairly often another 5%. And on any given year, about 1.5% of clergy leave. So it has increased, but it hasn't increased very much. So I do think the dynamic is there, but I think most clergy are still involved. I mean, they're exhausted, they're worn out, they're confused, right? They don't know which direction to go, but they haven't abandoned the ministry yet. Not that we've seen in the data.
Great, thank you. For those who support clergy well-being, which is a lot of us here today, Can you address anything about what you're seeing about the state of pastors right now, or do you see what are the greatest needs that you're seeing?
Yes, I'm glad that was a follow-up. We also asked a battery of questions that are replicated in the Harvard well-being study, and what we found compared to what the Harvard study found is that the clergy actually looked healthier than did the average person in the midst of the pandemic. They had a greater sense of well-being in terms of obviously spiritual health and mental health and physical health. It was actually quite impressive, I thought. But it does show, I think, as Melinda was talking about, that there is a level of resilience in a lot of the clergy. And when you think about what they had to go through and minister through, it's quite amazing.
It's fascinating.
Whether that remains is another story, and
yes.
we'll keep studying it. But
yeah, it's a bit of good news there to learn that.
I think so.
They have that resilience. Another question: what do you think is the most important? Do you have a piece of advice or a most significant piece of advice, perhaps, to give to pastors who are maybe just coming out of the pandemic at this time? Any thoughts on what you would say to them?
Well, to go back in a sense to the hopefulness of this moment, right? I think now is a perfect time to get the congregation to make changes that are needed. The culture, the reality of the world has changed, and congregations have to change. And we've gotten so much resistance from our flock in the past. But now you can say, yes, but look what you just did. Change isn't your anathema, right? You made it happen. And so we should be able to move forward now in positive ways, I think. So try.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Thank you. You mentioned earlier about pastoral burnout. And is there any data to report on clergy who have exited ministry during the past 2 years? I'm assuming related to burnout because of the pandemic. That's how I think the question is being posed.
Yeah.
Mark, you can feel free to correct me on that.
Yeah. The only change that we saw, and I've talked to a lot of the researchers in about 10 or 15 denominational groups, and they saw a slight uptick in the percent of pastors that were retiring. Not a great uptick, but I think a few more pastors who were past maybe retirement age just said, okay, I've had enough, and that's the only real change that we've seen, at least in the data so far.
Okay. The last question that I have here right now is sort of the opposite of what you just said about clergy who are maybe being bumped to retirement because of the effects of the pandemic. But what about those who may be coming in to the ministry, younger pastors or less experienced adults entering a ministry? Do you have any data on the pandemic impact on incoming clergy numbers?
Yeah, if to go back to look at that question that we ask about how often do you think about this, when we broke that out by ages of clergy, that what we saw was it was much more likely for women clergy and young clergy new in the field to have thought more about leaving the ministry. That didn't mean they did, but I think part of that was because they might have been in worse situations, right? New clergy, and it's common that women clergy also get to not the choicest spots, and so I think it's probably more a situational, contextual thing than it is necessarily who they are as leaders.
Right. Okay. I just had a question since I don't see another one on there. I'll ask one I was thinking about regarding conflict. I was, like you, surprised that the stats weren't a little higher on that from everything we were hearing. certainly those of us that maybe work at a denominational level. But did you have any stats on that relate maybe the demographics, like rural versus urban, things like that? I was just curious to know with conflict if you saw more of that, or church size even.
Yeah, it was the real variable that made a big difference there was both mainline or not, but really the size of the congregation. If the congregation was between 100 attendees and 250, they were much more likely to have conflict than smaller congregations or much larger congregations. And I think some of that has to do with that kind of medium size, actually. Medium-sized congregation has more diversity of opinions and thoughts in some ways than either of the other two ends. And so consequently, they had a much higher rate of conflict, and the conflict was at a more serious level too than the others.
Oh, fascinating. One last question, Mary Catherine Nader.
Mary,
yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mary Catherine, and thank you for doing this talk. And also, I wanted to thank you. I got to help with the Women Thriving in Ministry project at Asbury Seminary. So I was the mentorship coach for the women, and of course that started right before the pandemic hit. So we were literally figuring it out, like flying the plane as we were going. And it was really interesting. I was meeting with the mentor coaches, the women who had been in ministry for a long time, who were then meeting with their new clergy women. So what you were just sharing, I thought was so interesting. And it was true to watch how the different experiences that they had as women, and then being in different points of ministry. And now I'm doing my doctoral dissertation on compassion fatigue in women clergy after the COVID pandemic. So that experience was really helpful for me. So I just wanted to tell you, thank you for doing that and for the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's it for questions as far as I can see. Thad, can I turn it back over to you?
Absolutely. Thanks to our technical support, Chloe, who's been with us throughout, for being a good girl. And thank you all so much for being with us today. I'll just make sure to pop into the chat again the link where you can share your feedback from today's presentation. We'd love to hear from you as well. When you go through that process, you can also register for next month's gathering, which again is going to be a part 2 to this great conversation. So we hope you'll come back and join us again. Thanks so much, everyone.